Admiral Marcus Johnson stepped into the bustling airport, his mind still buzzing with the events of the military conference he had just attended. The energy around him was typical for a weekday afternoon. Families rushing to catch their flights, business travelers typing away on laptops, and the occasional tourist dragging oversized luggage. Marcus moved with purpose, his casual attire blending seamlessly with the crowd. No one would guess that beneath his calm exterior lay the weight of years of service as a decorated Navy admiral. He approached the gate counter, pulling out his boarding pass from his wallet. The first-class seat had been a small luxury he allowed himself after weeks of grueling work. He handed the ticket to the gate agent, a young woman who seemed flustered as she juggled multiple tasks. Just as she began scanning it, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Excuse me." Marcus turned to see a middle-aged white woman standing nearby, her designer handbag slung over her shoulder and an air of entitlement radiating off her. She pointed at him, then at the gate agent. "I need to speak to someone about this seating arrangement," she said loudly, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Her tone dripped with irritation, and her eyes narrowed as she added, "This man cannot sit in first class." The gate agent froze, clearly caught off guard. Marcus raised an eyebrow but remained silent, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. Karen, as Marcus mentally dubbed her, continued her tirade. "I've flown this airline for years. I have elite status. That seat belongs to me." She gestured dramatically toward the plane, as if claiming ownership over the entire aircraft. Other passengers began whispering among themselves. Some looked annoyed by Karen's behavior, while others avoided eye contact altogether, unwilling to get involved. Marcus felt a familiar pang of frustration creeping up but pushed it aside. Over the years, he'd learned to pick his battles carefully. Still, the absurdity of the moment wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a high-ranking Navy officer, being questioned about whether he belonged in first class. Karen leaned closer to the gate agent, lowering her voice but ensuring everyone could still hear. "Are you sure this is right? Maybe there's been a mistake." Her implication hung heavy in the air. Someone like him didn't belong in such a prestigious section of the plane. The gate agent hesitated, glancing between Marcus and Karen. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "Sir, I'm sorry, but we're going to need to reassign your seat." Marcus stared at her, disbelief flickering across his face. This wasn't the first time he'd faced discrimination, but each instance stung just the same. He nodded curtly, refusing to give Karen, or anyone else, the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. As he walked away from the counter, Marcus couldn't help but notice the smug expression spreading across Karen's face. She strutted past him, clutching her boarding pass like a trophy. For a brief moment, he considered saying something, revealing his rank, demanding justice, but he stopped himself. There would be time enough for that later. Right now, he needed to focus on keeping his composure. After all, turbulence wasn't limited to airplanes. Sometimes, it came in human form too. As Admiral Marcus Johnson made his way to the economy section of the plane, he couldn't shake the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. The denial of his rightful seat wasn't just about comfort, it was about respect. Here he was, a man who had dedicated decades of his life to serving his country, being treated as though he didn't belong. He clenched his jaw and reminded himself to stay calm. Losing his temper wouldn't solve anything, and besides, he'd faced far worse challenges in his career. The economy cabin was cramped, with passengers squeezed into narrow seats like sardines in a tin. Marcus found his assigned spot near the back of the plane, wedged between a teenager scrolling endlessly on their phone and an older man snoring softly. He stowed his carry-on bag overhead and settled into the stiff, worn-out seat. It wasn't exactly what he had envisioned for this flight, but he tried to make the best of it. After all, he reasoned, it was only a few hours. Meanwhile, Karen, the woman who had caused the scene at the gate, strode confidently toward the front of the plane, her heels clicking against the aisle floor. She slid into Marcus's original first-class seat by the window, visibly pleased with herself. A flight attendant greeted her warmly, offering her a glass of champagne. Karen accepted it with a smile, leaning back in the plush leather chair as if she owned the place. She chatted animatedly with the passenger beside her, bragging about how she always got what she wanted when she spoke up. Marcus couldn't help but glance toward the front of the plane every now and then. From where he sat, he could see Karen relaxing in the very seat he should have been occupying. Her behavior gnawed at him, not because he cared about the luxury of first class, but because of the underlying message her actions sent. To Karen, it seemed clear that someone like him, a black man dressed casually, didn't deserve the same privileges she took for granted. It wasn't just rude, it was dehumanizing. Other passengers around him began to notice the contrast too. An elderly woman seated across the aisle gave Marcus a sympathetic look, shaking her head disapprovingly. A young couple whispered to each other, glancing toward the front of the plane before looking back at Marcus. No one said anything directly, but the tension in the air was palpable. Everyone knew something unfair had happened, yet no one dared to step in. Marcus pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails to distract himself. But his mind kept drifting back to the incident at the gate. He thought about how often he encountered situations like this, moments when people underestimated him or questioned his worth based on appearances. Over the years, he'd learned to let these things roll off his back. Still, they left scars, small reminders that despite his achievements, some people would never see him as an equal. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the pilot came over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard and thanking them for choosing the airline. Marcus listened quietly, his hands resting on his lap. He noticed Karen raising her glass of champagne in a mock toast to the announcement, laughing loudly with her neighbor. For a fleeting moment, Marcus considered walking up to her and confronting her right then and there. He imagined the look on her face if he revealed his rank, watched her squirm under the weight of her own arrogance. But he quickly dismissed the idea. There was no point in making a spectacle of himself. Not yet, anyway. Instead, he closed his eyes and leaned his head against the seat, letting out a slow, steady breath. This wasn't the battle he wanted to fight today. If anything, the situation only reinforced why he continued to advocate for equality and fairness, both within the military and beyond. For now, though, he decided to endure the discomfort and wait. Sometimes, patience was the most powerful weapon of all. The revelation hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and undeniable. Karen stared at Admiral Marcus Johnson's military ID, her face pale and her mouth slightly agape. The polished badge reflected the dim cabin lights, its authenticity impossible to dispute. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Passengers nearby craned their necks, trying to catch a glimpse of the ID or gauge Karen's reaction. Some exchanged knowing glances, while others whispered to one another, piecing together what had just happened. Karen finally broke the silence, her voice trembling as she stammered. "I didn't know." Her earlier bravado was gone, replaced by an awkward mix of defensiveness and embarrassment. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, avoiding eye contact with both Marcus and the growing number of curious onlookers. "You should have said something earlier," she muttered weakly, attempting to shift the blame onto him. Marcus raised an eyebrow but remained calm. He leaned forward slightly, his tone measured yet firm. "Ma'am, I don't owe anyone an explanation about who I am or where I belong," he replied. "But since you made it your business to question my right to sit in first class, I thought it was only fair to clarify things." His words struck a chord, not just with Karen, but with everyone within earshot. A middle-aged man seated across the aisle nodded approvingly, muttering under his breath, "Well said." Even the flight attendant, who had been refilling drinks nearby, paused mid-step, clearly intrigued by the unfolding drama. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted. What had started as mild curiosity now bordered on admiration for Marcus and discomfort toward Karen. Karen tried to recover, fumbling for words that would justify her behavior. "Look, I wasn't trying to. I mean, it's not like I knew you were. She trailed off, realizing there was no way to salvage the situation without sounding even more foolish. Instead, she crossed her arms tightly over her chest, sinking lower into her plush first-class seat. Her earlier confidence was unrecognizable now, replaced by a visible unease that radiated from her body language. Sensing the tension, the older man sitting next to Karen leaned toward her cautiously. "Ma'am," he began gently, "you might want to apologize. That's all anyone's asking for here." His suggestion drew a collective murmur of agreement from nearby passengers. One woman chimed in softly, "It's the right thing to do." Karen hesitated, her pride warring with the mounting pressure around her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she turned reluctantly toward Marcus. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, barely audible over the hum of the plane's engines. It wasn't heartfelt, it lacked sincerity, but it was enough to diffuse some of the tension in the cabin. Marcus accepted her apology with grace, nodding once. "Thank you," he said simply, his tone neutral. He didn't gloat or press the issue further, choosing instead to let the matter rest. To Marcus, this wasn't about revenge or humiliation. It was about asserting his dignity and reminding those around him. And perhaps Karen herself, that respect shouldn't be conditional based on appearances. As the confrontation ended, the mood in the cabin began to shift again. Passengers returned to their own conversations, though snippets of the incident continued to ripple through the rows. Someone joked quietly, "Guess we all learned something today," earning a few chuckles from those nearby. Others offered Marcus nods of approval or quiet thanks when they passed by his seat. For Karen, however, the remainder of the flight was anything but comfortable. Every glance from fellow passengers felt like judgment, every whisper a reminder of her earlier actions. She avoided making eye contact with anyone, retreating into herself as if trying to disappear entirely. Meanwhile, Marcus sat calmly in his economy seat, unaffected by the chaos. If anything, he seemed almost relieved. Justice, however small, had been served, not through anger or retaliation, but through honesty and composure. By the time the turbulence subsided and the pilot announced they were approaching their destination, the energy in the cabin had changed entirely. What had begun as a routine flight had transformed into a lesson none of the passengers would soon forget, a testament to the power of humility, respect, and standing up for oneself with quiet strength. The plane rumbled down the runway, engines roaring as it picked up speed. Admiral Marcus Johnson gripped the armrests lightly, feeling the familiar sensation of takeoff press him into his seat. He'd flown countless times before, often in military aircraft under far more intense conditions, but there was something about this flight that felt different. Maybe it was the lingering sting of being denied his rightful seat, or the smug presence of Karen just a few rows ahead, sipping champagne and chatting loudly. Whatever it was, Marcus couldn't shake the weight of the moment. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, Marcus leaned back and closed his eyes, trying to find some semblance of peace. But instead of relaxing, his mind began to wander. He thought about the gate incident again, not with anger, but with a quiet resolve. Over the years, he'd faced prejudice in many forms, from subtle glances to outright hostility. Each time, he reminded himself that these moments weren't personal. They were reflections of a deeper societal issue. Still, it didn't make them any easier to swallow. He glanced toward the front of the plane, where Karen was now reclining comfortably in her stolen seat. She laughed at something her neighbor said, completely oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the discomfort she'd caused earlier. Marcus shook his head slightly, marveling at how entitled some people could be. To Karen, this was likely just another day, another victory in her self-proclaimed quest for fairness. But to Marcus, it was a reminder of how much work still needed to be done to bridge the gaps of understanding between people. His thoughts drifted further, pulling up memories from his decades-long career in the Navy. He recalled the long nights spent strategizing during missions, the camaraderie of his fellow sailors, and the pride of earning each promotion through hard work and dedication. Yet even within the structured world of the military, He hadn't been immune to bias. There had been times when colleagues questioned his abilities simply because of the color of his skin. Instead of letting it break him, Marcus used those moments as fuel to push harder, to prove not only to others, but also to himself that he belonged exactly where he was. The turbulence started suddenly, jolting the plane and snapping Marcus out of his reverie. Passengers gasped as their belongings shifted in overhead compartments, and a few nervous murmurs rippled through the cabin. Marcus remained unfazed. He'd experienced worse turbulence while flying over oceans and deserts, but he noticed Karen gripping her armrests tightly, her confident demeanor faltering. For the first time since boarding, she looked genuinely uneasy. Seated near the window, Karen peered outside, her face pale as the plane bounced through rough patches of air. She called out to a flight attendant, demanding reassurance that everything was fine. The attendant offered a polite smile and assured her that turbulence was normal, but Karen didn't seem convinced. Her voice grew louder, tinged with panic. "Are you sure we're safe? Shouldn't the pilot do something?" Marcus watched silently, observing how quickly Karen's bravado dissolved under pressure. It struck him as ironic. Earlier, she had acted as though she owned the plane, yet now she seemed powerless against forces beyond her control. Life, he mused, had a way of humbling even the most arrogant individuals. Amid the chaos, Marcus caught sight of something unexpected. His dog tags, which he always wore beneath his shirt, had slipped out unnoticed. They gleamed faintly in the dim cabin light, catching the attention of a nearby passenger, an older man who had been watching the events unfold since the gate incident. The man leaned closer, squinting at the tags before turning to Marcus with wide eyes. "Are you military?" he asked softly, clearly surprised. Marcus nodded, keeping his tone neutral. "Yes, sir. Navy." The man's expression shifted from curiosity to admiration. "Thank you for your service," he said sincerely. His words carried a weight that momentarily drowned out the noise of the turbulent cabin. Marcus gave a small nod of acknowledgement, appreciating the gesture but choosing not to elaborate further. For the first time since the ordeal began, Marcus felt a flicker of satisfaction. While Karen continued to fret over the turbulence, clinging to her fragile sense of control, Marcus sat calmly, grounded by years of experience and resilience. The storm outside might have shaken the plane, but inside, Marcus knew exactly who he was, and that was worth far more than any first-class seat. The days following the flight transformed Admiral Marcus Johnson's life in ways he hadn't anticipated. What had started as a routine trip home quickly became national news, sparking conversations across social media, news outlets, and even talk shows. Passengers who had been on the flight shared their accounts online, posting photos of Marcus's military ID and recounting the confrontation with Karen. Some described her behavior as entitled and racist, while others praised Marcus for his calmness and dignity under pressure. The hashtag #RespectForAll trended for 2 consecutive days, drawing thousands of comments from people eager to share their own experiences with discrimination. Marcus initially avoided the spotlight, preferring to focus on his responsibilities as a Navy admiral. But when he saw how deeply the incident resonated with so many people, he decided to use his platform to amplify the message. He gave interviews to major networks, not to criticize Karen personally, but to highlight the broader issue of racial bias and privilege. In one interview, he said simply, "This isn't about one person or one moment. It's about recognizing that respect should never depend on appearances. We all have work to do to ensure equality becomes the norm, not the exception." His words struck a chord with viewers. Many saw him as a symbol of resilience and grace, someone who handled adversity with poise rather than anger. Teachers used his story in classrooms to discuss fairness and empathy, while community leaders cited it as an example of standing up against injustice without resorting to hostility. Even within the military, colleagues reached out to commend him for representing the values they all strived to uphold: honor, courage, and commitment. On the other side of the equation, Karen found herself at the center of widespread criticism. Her name and face were plastered across social media, often accompanied by harsh captions calling her actions unacceptable. Friends and acquaintances reportedly distanced themselves from her, embarrassed by the association. Local news outlets attempted to contact her for comment, but she refused to speak publicly, leaving her side of the story untold. Instead, she retreated from public view, canceling plans and avoiding crowded places. The airline acted swiftly in response to the backlash. They released a formal apology to Marcus, acknowledging the failure of their staff to handle the situation appropriately. "We deeply regret the treatment Admiral Johnson received." The statement read, "No passenger should ever feel disrespected or undervalued while traveling with us." Alongside the apology, the company announced new initiatives aimed at addressing bias among employees, including mandatory diversity training programs and stricter accountability measures for discriminatory behavior. Passengers applauded the airline's efforts, though some remained skeptical, urging them to follow through on their promises. One frequent flyer commented online, "It's easy to say sorry after getting caught. Let's see if they actually make lasting changes." Others pointed out that this wasn't an isolated incident. Many travelers of color shared stories of similar encounters, highlighting the systemic nature of the problem. Meanwhile, Marcus continued advocating for meaningful change beyond the headlines. He partnered with organizations focused on racial equity and education, using his influence to push for policies that promoted inclusivity. He also spoke candidly about the emotional toll of facing prejudice, encouraging others to speak up when they witnessed unfair treatment. "Silence only enables these behaviors to continue," he told an audience during a virtual panel discussion. "We must hold each other accountable, not with hatred, but with understanding and action." As the weeks passed, the initial fervor around the incident began to fade, but its impact lingered. Schools incorporated discussions about bias into their curriculums, inspired by Marcus's example. Airlines reviewed their customer service protocols, determined to avoid repeating mistakes like the one made at the gate that day. And individuals reflected on their own biases, questioning whether they too had ever judged someone unfairly based on superficial assumptions. For Marcus, the experience reinforced his belief in the power of patience and integrity. He hadn't sought fame or revenge. He simply wanted to be treated with the same respect afforded to anyone else. Yet, in doing so, he ignited a movement that reminded countless people of the importance of standing firm in the face of injustice, and doing so with grace. Though he returned to his duties as a Navy admiral, his legacy as a voice for equality continued to inspire those fighting for a fairer, more compassionate world. When the plane finally touched down and taxied to the gate, the passengers began gathering their belongings, eager to disembark after the long and eventful flight. Admiral Marcus Johnson took his time, allowing others to exit ahead of him. He wasn't in a rush. There was still one more thing he needed to address before stepping off the aircraft. As people filed out, some paused briefly to thank him or offer a kind word, their expressions conveying a mix of respect and admiration. One young woman even shook his hand, saying softly, "What you did back there, it meant a lot. Thank you." Karen, meanwhile, lingered near the front of the plane, her movements slow and deliberate as if hoping to delay facing the inevitable scrutiny awaiting her outside. She avoided looking in Marcus's direction entirely, focusing instead on adjusting her bag and straightening her clothes. It was clear she wanted nothing more than to disappear into the crowd as quickly as possible. As Marcus made his way toward the exit, a flight attendant approached him with an apologetic smile. "Sir," she said quietly, "we noticed what happened earlier, and we'd like to speak with you about it. Could you spare a moment when we land?" Her tone was sincere, and Marcus nodded without hesitation. "Of course," he replied. "I think it's important we address this." Once inside the terminal, Marcus followed the airline staff to a small office near the gate. There, he met with a supervisor who listened intently as he recounted the events from check-in to the turbulence-filled confrontation aboard the plane. The supervisor's expression grew increasingly troubled as Marcus described how the gate agent had denied him access to his rightful seat and how Karen's behavior had escalated the situation. "I understand mistakes can happen," Marcus explained calmly, "but discrimination shouldn't be one of them. This isn't just about me. It's about ensuring that no one else has to go through something like this because of prejudice or bias." His words carried weight, not just because of his rank, but because of the quiet authority with which he spoke. The supervisor nodded vigorously, taking notes and promising immediate action. Word of the incident spread quickly among the ground crew. Several employees expressed outrage over how Marcus had been treated, while others admitted they weren't surprised, citing similar complaints from passengers in the past. One baggage handler stopped Marcus briefly to shake his hand, saying, "We see stuff like this too often. But sir, seeing someone stand up like you did, it gives us hope." While Marcus handled the matter professionally, Karen found herself cornered by airport security. Passengers who had witnessed her behavior reported her conduct to the authorities, describing her aggressive demeanor at the gate and her dismissive attitude during the flight. When questioned, Karen grew defensive, insisting she had done nothing wrong. It was all just a misunderstanding, she protested, her voice rising in frustration. "I didn't know he was an admiral." Her excuses fell flat, especially when confronted with statements from both Marcus and other passengers. Security informed her that her actions were being documented and warned her that future incidents could result in travel restrictions. Though they didn't press formal charges, the warning left Karen visibly shaken. She slunk away from the scene, clutching her designer handbag tightly, her usual air of confidence completely shattered. Back in the office, the airline supervisor assured Marcus that steps would be taken to prevent such incidents in the future. "We're going to review our training protocols for gate agents and customer service staff," she promised, "and we'll make sure everyone understands the importance of treating all passengers with respect, regardless of appearance or background." Marcus appreciated the gesture but emphasized that accountability mattered more than promises. "Actions speak louder than words," he reminded her gently. "This isn't just about me. It's about creating a culture where everyone feels valued and respected." By the time Marcus left the office, news of the incident had already begun circulating online. Fellow passengers shared their accounts on social media, praising Marcus for his poise and calling out Karen's behavior. Hashtags like #RespectForAll and #StandWithAdmiral Johnson started trending, sparking conversations about racial bias and privilege in everyday life. What had begun as a personal encounter between two individuals was now part of a larger dialogue, one that challenged society to reflect on its values and biases. As Marcus walked away from the terminal, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. He hadn't sought attention or drama, but sometimes standing up for yourself created ripples far beyond what you intended. And perhaps, he thought, those ripples could lead to real change. The ripple effects of Admiral Marcus Johnson's encounter on the flight continued to spread far beyond the confines of the airplane cabin. What had started as a personal moment of discrimination became a catalyst for broader societal reflection. Social media users, activists, and everyday citizens began sharing stories of their own experiences with bias, creating a groundswell of awareness about the subtle, and not so subtle, ways prejudice manifests in daily life. The #RespectForAll evolved into a movement, inspiring people to speak up when they witnessed unfair treatment and to challenge their own assumptions about others. Karen's actions served as a cautionary tale, illustrating how unchecked privilege and entitlement can lead to public embarrassment and accountability. Though she largely disappeared from the public eye, her behavior became a case study in discussions about racial bias and microaggressions. Experts used her example to highlight the dangers of making snap judgments based on appearance or stereotypes. "It's easy to think you're right until reality proves otherwise," one commentator noted during a morning talk show segment. This incident reminds us that humility and self-awareness are essential if we want to build a more inclusive society. For Marcus, the aftermath of the flight reinforced his belief in the importance of leading by example. He didn't set out to shame Karen or make headlines. He simply wanted to be treated with the same dignity and respect everyone deserves. Yet, his calm and composed response struck a chord with millions, proving that standing firm doesn't always mean raising your voice. It can also mean staying true to your values without stooping to someone else's level. His story inspired countless individuals to approach conflicts with patience and integrity rather than anger or retaliation. The airline faced intense scrutiny in the weeks following the incident, but it also seized the opportunity to implement meaningful change. They launched an internal review of their customer service practices, focusing specifically on gate agents and frontline staff who interact directly with passengers. New training modules were introduced, emphasizing cultural sensitivity and conflict resolution. Employees participated in workshops designed to help them recognize unconscious biases and address discriminatory behavior promptly and effectively. To hold themselves accountable, the airline created an anonymous reporting system where passengers could share feedback about their experiences without fear of reprisal. Passengers noticed the difference almost immediately. Travelers praised the improved interactions with gate agents and flight attendants, noting a shift toward greater empathy and professionalism. One frequent flyer wrote online, "I've flown this airline before, and I have to say, there's been a noticeable improvement. It feels like they're actually listening now." Others echoed similar sentiments, crediting the changes to the lessons learned from Marcus's experience. Meanwhile, Marcus returned to his duties as a Navy Admiral, balancing his military responsibilities with his growing role as an advocate for equality. He traveled across the country, speaking at schools, community centers, and corporate events about the importance of respect and inclusion. His message was simple yet powerful. We all have biases. They're part of being human. But what sets us apart is whether we choose to confront those biases or let them dictate our actions. Every day, we have the chance to do better. His words resonated deeply with audiences of all ages and backgrounds. Teachers incorporated his story into lesson plans, using it to teach students about fairness and empathy. Corporations invited him to lead diversity workshops, eager to foster workplaces where everyone felt valued. And ordinary people shared his interviews with friends and family, finding inspiration in his ability to turn adversity into advocacy. As time went on, the incident faded from the front pages, but its impact endured. Conversations about racial bias and privilege became more commonplace, encouraging people to examine their own behaviors and attitudes. Airports and airlines implemented new policies aimed at preventing similar incidents, ensuring that no passenger would ever again feel unwelcome because of the color of their skin or how they dressed. And Marcus, though humble about his role in sparking these changes, remained steadfast in his commitment to creating a world where respect wasn't conditional, it was universal. In the end, the story of the Black Navy Admiral who revealed his rank to a prejudiced passenger wasn't just about justice served, it was about hope ignited. It reminded everyone that even in moments of tension and injustice, there is always room for growth, understanding, and progress. And sometimes, all it takes is one person standing tall to inspire countless others to do the same. The turbulence grew worse, and the plane rocked violently as it moved through the storm. Passengers gripped their armrests tightly, some closing their eyes in prayer while others exchanged nervous glances. The cabin lights flickered faintly, adding to the tension. A child cried out in fear, prompting a mother to hush them gently but firmly. Amid the chaos, Karen's earlier bravado crumbled completely. She clutched her seatbelt with white-knuckled hands, her champagne glass long abandoned on the tray table beside her. Karen leaned forward anxiously, calling out to a passing flight attendant. "Excuse me," she shouted over the noise of the rattling plane. "Can you tell us what's happening? Is this normal?" Her voice was high-pitched and frantic, drawing attention from nearby passengers. The flight attendant paused briefly, offering a polite but strained smile. "We're experiencing some turbulence due to weather conditions," she explained. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Despite the reassurance, Karen wasn't satisfied. She turned to the passenger beside her, gripping his arm as if seeking comfort. "This doesn't feel right," she said loudly. "Shouldn't the pilot be doing something about this?" Her neighbor nodded awkwardly, clearly just as uneasy but unwilling to engage further. Karen's panic only seemed to grow, her breathing quickening as she alternated between staring out the window and glancing toward the cockpit door. Meanwhile, Admiral Marcus Johnson remained calm in his economy seat, unfazed by the shaking plane. Years of flying combat missions had taught him how to stay composed during far more dangerous situations. He kept his eyes closed, focusing on his breathing and letting the turbulence roll off him like water off a ship's deck. Still, he couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between his reaction and Karen's escalating distress. It was almost ironic. Earlier, she had acted as though she ruled the skies. Yet now she seemed utterly powerless against forces beyond her control. As the plane continued to bounce through the storm, Karen's gaze darted around the cabin, searching for someone or something to reassure her. That's when her eyes landed on Marcus. At first, she didn't recognize him. The man sitting in economy was a far cry from the image of wealth and authority she associated with first class, but something caught her attention. His dog tags, still visible beneath his shirt, gleamed faintly in the dim light of the cabin. Curiosity, or perhaps guilt, piqued her interest. She unbuckled her seatbelt slightly and leaned into the aisle, craning her neck to get a better look. "Hey, you," she called out, pointing at Marcus. Her tone was sharp, cutting through the hum of the engines. "Are you even supposed to be wearing those? Have you ever flown before?" Marcus opened his eyes slowly, meeting her gaze with an unreadable expression. For a moment, he considered ignoring her entirely, letting her assumptions hang in the air. But then he decided otherwise. With deliberate calmness, he sat up straighter and addressed her directly. "Yes, Mom," he replied evenly. "I've flown quite a bit. More than most people, actually." His response took Karen aback. She blinked, momentarily unsure how to proceed. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. "You don't look like someone who flies often." Marcus allowed himself a small, knowing smile. "Well," he began, his tone measured but firm, "when you spend decades serving in the Navy, including leading missions overseas, flying becomes second nature." He paused, letting his words sink in. Then, as casually as if discussing the weather, he added, "Oh, and I'm an Admiral, by the way." The effect was immediate. Karen froze, her mouth half open as she processed what he just said. Around them, other passengers perked up, intrigued by the exchange. Some leaned closer to hear better, while others exchanged surprised looks. One man whispered audibly to his companion, "Did he say Admiral?" Karen recovered quickly, though her face flushed red with embarrassment. "That can't be true," she scoffed dismissively. "You're just saying that." Her tone carried a hint of desperation, as if denying his claim would somehow erase the growing unease in the pit of her stomach. But Marcus wasn't done yet. Without making a scene, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his military ID card. Holding it up so only Karen and a few surrounding passengers could see, he let the evidence speak for itself. The room fell silent except for the distant rumble of thunder outside. Even the turbulence seemed to quiet down for a moment, as if holding its breath along with everyone else. Karen stared at the ID, her confidence crumbling faster than the plane had dipped through the storm clouds. Her lips parted as if to argue, but no words came out. Instead, she sank back into her seat, her earlier arrogance replaced by a mix of shame and